Hello and welcome everyone to today's Fairygodboss live webinar. We are so excited to have you all join us, and we'll give everyone a few seconds to connect. While you're waiting, we would love to know where everyone is tuning in from today. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a chat box. So if you feel comfortable doing so, please send a message in the chat saying hi and letting us know where you're joining from. All right, I see some folks have already commented in, and we have folks from all over: Ohio, Indiana. I'm tuning in from Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's so great. We are thrilled to have you here. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Gabby Caracciolo, VP of Client Operations at Fairygodboss and The Muse, and wanted to get started with just a few quick announcements. Rest assured, the session will be recorded and shared with you all via email after the event. And during the discussion, we would love to hear from you. We hope that you'll use the stage chat at the right-hand side of your screen to send messages, comments, and questions to one another and to our speaker. For those of you who don't know, Fairygodboss is the largest career community for women. Millions of women come to Fairygodboss for career connections, jobs, community advice, hard to find intel about how companies treat women, and virtual events just like this. And now I am excited to kick off today's event, Navigating the Workplace with Emotional Intelligence, Essential Skills for Success, sponsored by RTX. Today, we're joined by Dr. Lexi Hernandez, Executive Director of DE&I Workforce Initiatives at RTX. Lexi, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Gabby. I really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be joining you all here today. And I am joining from sunny, already getting too hot, Tucson, Arizona. And so I see a couple of my Arizona folks on the line as well, which is great to see individuals from all over the country. So I am really thrilled to be joining you all here today to talk about this really critical skill called emotional intelligence, and how can we really leverage it to navigate the workplace. And so, as Gabby mentioned, I'm Lexi Hernandez. I lead DE&I Workforce Initiatives for RTX. And so my team is essentially responsible for all of our DE&I talent attraction and talent development strategies. And I've spent most of my career in the talent and people space. So helping to develop and deploy leadership development programs, career development, helping to onboard new individuals into organizations, helping to really create inclusive people practices that take equity into perspective. And so we'll be talking a lot about all of those types of things here today. And more specifically, we'll talk about what emotional intelligence, or EQ, is, and what are the critical skills behind emotional intelligence. What's the connection between EQ and both personal as well as professional success? And we'll talk about how can we put EQ into practice when it comes to things like change and navigating changes that we're all going through, as well as being able to leverage EQ to really harness the power of inclusion in our workplaces. So yes, please feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout today's session. I also have some activities that I'll be asking you to use the chat to engage in. And before we really dive in, I first and foremost want to give a shout out to a couple of my colleagues who really helped me to prepare for today's session. First of all, I'd like to shout out Angelica Ruiz, who's a member of my organization and my team. And she works really closely with Fairygodboss and help to inspire this event and set everything up. I'd also like to thank Mary Kahn, who's another member of our organization. Mary and I have worked side by side, exchanging best practices around emotional intelligence for more than a decade. And she helped to provide some recent research and some key things that I'll be sharing today as well. So I want to thank both of them and the rest of my team. So for those of you just turning in, just a reminder, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions as we go throughout. And in fact, we're going to get started with using the chat feature Now, I would like to get to know all of you a little bit better in terms of the experience or the exposure that you've had up until this point with emotional intelligence. So I love to hear from you. What's been your exposure to emotional intelligence? And I put a couple of recommendations up on the slide, but feel free to indicate other types of experiences. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing about it, or perhaps you've read every single one of Daniel Goleman's books on emotional intelligence, or as I'm starting to talk about emotional intelligence, you're thinking to yourself, oh geez, what did I get myself into? We're going to be talking about emotions. Oh no. So feel free to add to the chat. What's been your exposure? All right, we have some individuals who've taken some EQ assessments. That's great to see. Been through some training, read some articles, taken a couple courses on it. Perfect. Learning how to leverage it in different scenarios. Great. Appreciate you all sharing. You've read some different articles and books. It's been part of your coursework when you were completing your bachelor's degree. Thank you. This is great. Absolutely. So thank you so much for sharing. You work at a place that's 75% and 40% non-binary, and being able to leverage topics like and skill sets like emotional intelligence inclusion in our workplaces. That's great. Fantastic. Feel free to continue to add into the chat in terms of what your exposure has been. Really helpful for me to kind of frame the conversation as we go forward. So let's talk about what EQ is. And this may be a bit of a refresher for those of you who have had some courses or have read some books around emotional intelligence. But as you're likely noticing, there's a bunch of different EQ models that are out there. This model that relates to and identifies 4 key skills of emotional intelligence comes from Drs. Travis Bradbury and Dr. Jean Greaves, who wrote the Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book, the Emotional Intelligence Quick book. And those are great resources to have as well, and often come with that free online self-assessment. And so I really like highlighting this particular model as it relates to workplaces, because it can boil it down to just these 4 core skills of EQ, and it gives you an opportunity to really think about how you put it into practice. So it's one thing, of course, for us to be aware of what emotional intelligence is and what these core skills entail, but what do we do with it? What do we do with this information? Can we put it into practice? And that's going to be a lot of what we focus in on here today. So I'm leveraging this 4 core skill model, but again, there are others out there. So when we look at the definition, really emotional intelligence is your ability or your skill to recognize and understand emotions. That's understanding your own emotions as they're happening, as well as others' emotions in the moment, to be able to really navigate relationships in a positive way. And so I think those are a couple of key factors that are really important to consider with emotional intelligence, especially as we start to break down each of these skills. So self-awareness is knowing how you will act and react in the moment. So there's this element of being prepared as you go into certain situations where you know that you might have some level of an emotional reaction, as well as being able to pick up on and spotlight your emotions as they're happening in the moment. And that is all too often where we get tripped up. And I'll tell you why that is. Next, we have self-management. And then that's what you do with that information. So once you've become aware of your emotions, you have a choice to make. And that choice comes with practice. What are you going to do with that emotion? What might be some positive steps you can take to have that positive outcome? So there's choice and practice as we move from self-awareness into self-management. And that's all really dealing with ourself, right? Now, as we look at the bottom part, social awareness and relationship management, we start to get into how are we relating and working with others. So that social awareness component being, are you able to recognize and understand the emotions in others? Again, prior to an event or as they're happening. And relationship management really takes all of the other 3 skills and puts it into practice to be able to get to that positive relationship outcome. We're going to be diving into each one of these skill sets a bit more throughout today's session. But what I will call out, I think it's really critical for us to understand, emotional intelligence is a skill that with practice, we can learn. We can make new habits. We can become much more emotionally intelligent. But it is a journey, and it does take that practice and intentionality. So I'll be giving you some tips and tricks also throughout today's session to help you really figure out and focus in on the right skills at the right time and in the right way. So with that, I want to take us to our next activity. So I'd like for you to, as I'm explaining this activity, to either get out a piece of paper if you like to write things down, open up a Word document, open up OneNote, however you like to take some notes, because I'm going to ask you to jot down a couple of ideas. What I like for you to think about is a leader. It could be a leader in your workplace. It could be a community leader. It could be a teacher that you've engaged with. I'd like for you to think about a leader or a teacher that you have had who has brought out the best in you. When you're working with this leader or working with this teacher, when you're engaging with them, when you're part of that team, you're feeling productive, you're feeling excited and committed, you're engaged, you're reaching those peak levels of performance. This leader is really just bringing out the best in you. So I want you to think about that leader. And I'd like for you to write down a couple of thoughts around what are the characteristics, what are the traits that this leader demonstrates. So what are some of those characteristics? What are some of those traits? What are some of those behaviors that this leader who brings out the best in you, what do they demonstrate? What have you seen this person demonstrate from a behavior or characteristic standpoint? So take a couple of minutes to write down some ideas. Just write them down on your own notepad, in your own files. All right, next, I like for you to think about the opposite. Consider a leader, a teacher, maybe even a team member who, a mentor, perhaps, somebody else that you've interacted with who brought out the worst in you. So when you're working with this leader, working with this team member, you get frustrated, you become disengaged, perhaps you're unhappy, unmotivated, you're just in that slump, right? So consider, again, the same thing. Think about not how you would describe that person. I can guess how many of us would describe those types of individuals as a person, but think about what behaviors, what characteristics, what traits did that person or does that person demonstrate? Write down a few ideas. So you got the leader on one side who's bringing out the best in you, and then you have the leader on the other side who's bringing out the worst in you. How would you describe their characteristics and behaviors and traits? All right, now, before I ask you to put some of your ideas in chat, what I will say is this is a professional environment. Let's be respectful and making sure that we don't need to provide any names. Keep the descriptions clean and respectful. I would much appreciate it. So go ahead and let's start off with the leader that brings out the worst in you. What were some of those characteristics or behaviors that you saw that leader demonstrate? A tyrant. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Other thoughts? The leader that brought out the worst in you. Ooh, Claire, great question. Shouldn't that person be called a boss instead of a leader? Absolutely, right? Leadership, as we'll talk about, right, is about inspiring, removing barriers, leading others to success. So we got unattentive, disinterested, disengaged, a poor listener, a micromanager, someone who criticizes, and untrusting. Yes, closed-minded, doesn't follow through, inflexible, inconsistent, unorganized, not present, easily blames others. Absolutely, a poor communicator, micromanaging, rude, thinks that they're always right. Yes, they come to the party saying, I will prove my point no matter what. Confrontational, ooh, lazy, yeah, inconsistent, not transparent, displays favoritism, yes, dishonest. Great list. Now let's move over to the best side. What were some of the characteristics and behaviors and traits that you wrote down that you saw the leader who brought out the best in you demonstrate? Let's talk about the best. Integrity, faithful towards others' work ethic, encouraging, motivating, high ownership, listens, kind, respectful, knowledgeable, supportive, a great listener, asks questions, embracing ideas with positivity, fair, compassionate, candid, calm, humble, visionary, empathetic, integrity. This is fantastic, approachable, trusting, showed you how to be a leader. Yes, courageous, understanding the hurdles and how to partner through them. Positive, willing to teach. Listens to understand, focuses on the end user. This is a phenomenal list of those types of behaviors and characteristics that describe individuals who really bring out the best in us. And to the comment earlier, right, that is leadership. When we're able to lead and we inspire others to follow us. Almost every time I facilitate this activity, it's one of my favorites. We see this common trend. You know, as we think about those examples of individuals who really inspire us, who help to engage and we feel like we're our most productive around versus those who we may, you know, where we experience that frustration and dissatisfaction. Those leaders on the best side, those characteristics that are being used to describe their behavior are more often than not interpersonal skills. Right? I maybe saw a trickle of one or two components in the list that spoke more to somebody's technical capability or even their IQ, right? When we think about what makes us great leaders, what makes us great team members, right? We are all leaders. You don't necessarily have to have individuals reporting to you. You are still a leader. What makes us great leaders are these interpersonal skills, our ability to relate, our ability to listen, act with courage, taking the time to get to know others, being a coach, being a mentor. They're rooted in emotional intelligence, or what some people call the soft skills. But I'll tell you what, they're often the hardest skills to develop because it takes practice and it takes intentionality. So I encourage you to think about as we go through the rest of this session, which list do you want to be on? I know that I definitely want to show up on that best list for my team, for my colleagues, for my peers and other leaders in the organization. And emotional intelligence is at the foundation of how we do just that. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Where did emotional intelligence come from, and how can it help build all those other skill sets and to lead it to those behaviors that you all put on the best list? So Daniel Goleman popularized the term emotional intelligence in the 1990s. He was originally researching cognitive intelligence. He was seeking to find out what kind of technical or cognitive ability set stellar performers apart from average performers. And what he came across was this notion of emotional intelligence, our ability to regulate our emotions, our ability to understand and respond in a positive way to the emotions of others. Because guess what? We are all emotional beings. And so he found that this ability to kind of recognize and understand and manage emotions is truly one of the most critical skills that we can bring not only to the workplace, but also to our personal lives, right? Relationships are so key, whether it's our personal relationships, whatever that may look like for each and every one of us, as well as relationships in the organization. Yes, it's a soft skill, so it has to be learned. Absolutely. And it takes time and effort to do that. So emotional intelligence is this foundational skill that we can start to build all these other types of skills on top of. When we think about leadership traits that make that strong or that best leader, having this level of awareness in terms of our own personal strengths and how to manage and regulate our emotions can lead us to creating that power and harnessing the power of critical decision making, right? As we're making decisions, are we picking up on the nuances that other people are sharing with us? Are we processing the information in real time to be able to make and stand by a critical decision? Are we able to adapt our leadership style to the needs of others? That also is relying on emotional intelligence to pick up on those needs of others and understanding if a leadership style may be a strength of ours, or maybe it's one that we need to practice so that we can show up in that way for our team members. Can we lead with authenticity and humility, right? Can we lead being true to who we are and, have some fun with it? That is baked in emotional intelligence. So EQ, by developing those 4 core skills around emotional intelligence, we can start to then continue the growth and build all these other types of leadership skill sets that really become critical in the workplace and helping ourselves to be successful as well as helping others be successful. One of the things that I want to mention as it relates to just how critical EQ is, again, kind of both in our personal and professional lives, is to be a leader, again, at any level, in any role, requires the ability to influence others. And that influence starts with emotional currency. So when you're engaging and interacting with peers, with team members, with anybody in the organization, from the CEO to the person greeting individuals at the door, to the new hires, right? Those interactions matter. Are you contributing to that emotional currency? Are you putting money in their emotional bank account, or are you depleting that cash? Because I'll tell you, when you go and ask that person for help on a project or help with something you have a question around, how quick, how willing are they to respond to that request from you if they don't have to, right? That emotional currency matters and it builds up. Every interaction is an opportunity. Now, we're not going to get it right 100% of the time. It's a journey, but are we working towards that? That's what matters. So how does this work? So emotional intelligence is really rooted in neuropsychology. And so forgive me for a moment as I kind of geek out over the brain research. This is really one of my favorite parts to talk about around emotional intelligence, because it explains, why we react and act in certain ways. We, again, whether we are aware of them or not, emotions surface in everything we do. And so what is our response in the moment can be found in how our brain is operating. And so think about, for example, right, history has taught us that we have that knee-jerk reaction when we experience an emotion to fight or flight, right? Do you stand and you want to go and argue with somebody, or do you want to flee the situation? Those are some of the emotional reactions that we can have when we're triggered. So I'm glad to see others enjoy this as well. So the way this works in our brain is that at the base of our brain, in our brain stem, is where we first experience a stimulus. So think about, for example, you're driving, you're in a great mood, you're happy, you're on your way to your happy destination, and the next thing you know, you get cut off. Somebody zooms in front of you, slams on their brake, and you're like, oh, that emotional, you got triggered, right? We have a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, what's going to happen in that moment? You feel that at the base of your brain first, and then it quickly travels to the mid part of your brain, our limbic system, which is where the amygdala is held. And that's the emotional part of our brain, right here, right above our ear area. We feel that emotional reaction. And it's in that moment where if we're triggered, we want to fight or flight, right? Are you then going to speed up and cut that person off? Or, what is your knee-jerk reaction in the moment when you're triggered? That happens so quickly, right? It can happen so fast that we often don't have time to allow for that stimulus, that trigger, that emotion to reach our prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex is where we rationally assign meaning to those emotions, right? So emotional intelligence is about combining all three of those systems and allowing the space and time and processing to happen to allow that emotion to reach your prefrontal cortex so you can rationally assign meaning out of it and respond in a positive way. So for some people, right, that are highly emotionally intelligent, their brain, this pathway between the base, the mid part, and the frontal part is like a 6-lane superhighway, right? It operates super fast. They've built in on ramps, off ramps. They got, they've practiced, they've put in the work to ensure that those emotional responses reach the prefrontal cortex. Now, for others, for some of us, sometimes myself included, it may be more of a country leisurely road, filled with trees, a road that's windy that you take a bit more time on, right? So it may take a little bit more practice to ensure that we're rationally processing those emotions before we act. So in that mid part, bridging that gap between the mid part of our brain and the prefrontal cortex is really the opportunity to practice emotional intelligence, to practice that self-management in the moment. So I'll give you an example. Prior to working for RTX, I worked for a consulting organization. And in my, fight, flight, or freeze. Absolutely. That was that third F. Thank you. I worked for a consulting company, and the major part of my role was interacting with our client organizations to help to design and deploy leadership development programs. So I was that client interface that often worked on projects. And I had another peer that I worked really closely with, and she was more senior than I was at this time. And we often worked together on building out plans for our different clients and proposals. And so we had a different working style, and we often found ourselves kind of butting heads on several different types of topics. And one of them was the way by which we would communicate with our partners, right? I asked to be involved, and anytime we would update a proposal and it was sent off to the customer, wanted to make sure I was aware of it. So in case they called, right, I knew what was happening. And there were several times where she did not include me when updates were made, and would often send off the proposal without my awareness. So one day, this had just happened. I get a phone call from one of our clients, and they were asking me about one of the changes to the proposal that I had no insight or awareness to. And I kind of played it off in the moment, kind of danced and tap danced around the question a little bit with the client. I remember hanging up the phone and just feeling that wave of heat surface in my body around frustration and anger in the moment for not being included for the X amount of time with my peer. And so I remember walking out of my office, and her office was to the left of mine, and to the right was the door to go outside. And I remember, having that heat flash and just thinking, oh man, am I gonna, really tell her off, get really, as much as for my colleagues, no, I don't really get too angry, but I was gonna get angry. I was gonna let her know that I was angry. And so I'm walking. And then I remember taking a step to go outside of my office, and my left foot was even turned a little bit left to go to her office. And it was like all of a sudden that emotional response hit my prefrontal cortex, and I stopped in the moment. I took a breath, and I thought, wait a minute, there might be something else going on here. And so instead of turning left, I made a conscious choice to go right. And I took a lap around the building outside, calm myself down, start to rationally think about the situation and what might be happening before going and having the conversation with her. And it allowed me to approach the situation in a much more socially aware way by starting the conversation with questions rather than attacking. So I want you to be thinking about, as we go through the next couple slides, what are those opportunities for you as you're having an emotional reaction to pause, to breathe, to reflect, to maybe perhaps understand what emotions you are feeling so that you can address them in a more positive way. Yes, I'm looking to note some of these comments here. Yeah, so great comment, Nicholas. Really appreciate you bringing that up in terms of having some concerns around that monetization. So the emotional bank account is where I think you're going with it. While a useful model, if taken deliberate practice, folks can see through it. Great observation, right? I think it's so much about how we do it. What's the tone that we're using? What is our true intent? And what impact is it having on others? Emotional intelligence, I've gotten the question before, right? Can emotional intelligence be used in a negative way in terms of manipulation, right? If we're so heightenedly aware of what we need to get out of this situation, will people notice it? Yes, absolutely. So when we start to move into more of the social awareness and relationship management, it is also about understanding and taking others into consideration, their needs, not just ours, but theirs as well. So when we're making deposits into that emotional bank account, we're doing it with the right intention. So great questions here. I'm going to take a few more as we transition to the next slide. How do we leverage EQ consistently in toxic and high pressure corporate cultures? Great question. All of these are fantastic. And that's actually leading us into a lot of our next discussion. So it's important to consider when we think about emotional intelligence, when we think about how we respond in these types of toxic environments, we really can only control our behavior. And so how are you responding in those moments? It can become increasingly more difficult if that environment is unwilling to change, if it remains toxic, even after conscious effort to remove or to mitigate that toxicity. There are some things that are just out of our control, right? If you've tried and building in some of these techniques that we'll talk about from a change and resiliency and well-being perspective, if you get to that point, you may need to consider other options. It's a hard choice to make, but one that you do have to consider the efforts you've put in to attempt to be a part of that change versus your overall well-being. So reminder, we can only control our own emotions, our own reactions. We can attempt to show up in a positive way and influence others, but at the end of the day, we don't have control over how others will respond. We can build that relationship, we can build trust, hopefully lead to a better outcome. Yeah, absolutely. So maintaining self-care is absolutely part of this EQ toolkit. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you all. So after what we've just talked about, I'd love to get other perspectives. How do you think emotional intelligence can contribute to the way that we manage change, or how we enable our own resiliency and well-being? What thoughts do you all have in terms of the role that emotional intelligence can play? Oh, I love this practice of the 4-for-4 breathing. Yes. Sarah, I actually did that right before this meeting. So taking 4 breaths in, holding it for 4 breaths, letting it out for 4 breaths, if that's what you're referring to, that is a technique that I use often, especially prior to presenting, right? The nerves are there. I'm excited, I'm nervous. So to just kind of calm the heart rate a little bit, that 4-4-4 breathing, in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth, can be really powerful. Yes, Corinne's walking out the door, going outside, being outside is one of my happy places. So in that moment, in that experience, being able to walk outdoors really helped me. Being a really great listener, yes, can help with change and resiliency and well-being. Is showing up well-rested, fed, open to the day. What that reads to me, what I hear in that response, is that you're taking care of yourself. And when it comes to change, and I know so many of us, there is a lot of change fatigue happening in our environments. So being able to put that oxygen mask on ourselves first and take care of ourselves first is really critical. So EQ supports setting a good example for others. Yes, in change, being able to listen and really listen, lean into questions and different perspectives definitely helps. So Jen Lim is the author of Beyond Happiness: How Authentic Leaders Prioritize Purpose and People for Growth and Impact. And she talks about in her book, Beyond Happiness, how we're living in an adaptive age. We are constantly having to adapt, right? There is a lot happening in our external environment. We're coming off of obviously a pandemic. We have global unrest. We have inflation. We have different organizations increasing, then decreasing in terms of workforce participation. A lot of is happening around us, and this is often described as a VUCA environment, VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And Jen talks about how VUCA can lead to FUD. FUD being fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? Those are, a lot of that is baked in emotion. when we're experiencing change, research also highlights that we have typically a stronger emotional response to change when we're feeling like the change is happening to us, instead of us being able to contribute and be part of the change. It's when that change is out of our control, right? When there is higher levels of uncertainty, it often does inflict greater levels of emotion. And so I encourage you to think about, in those moments, what can you control, right? What can you influence? Again, you can influence and understand the emotional reactions that you're having in that moment, how you're showing up for others in the organization, especially if you have to lead a team through change. You may not have all the answers, and that's okay. But being honest and transparent and saying, I don't know the answer to that question, but you know what? I'll do my best to find out. Or, what? I'm experiencing this too, and I'll be honest, I'm kind of having a hard time with it. Being vulnerable in the moment to showcase your emotions that you're feeling can be really powerful. Yeah, we want to be part of the change. We don't want to have it put on us, but sometimes that's out of our control. Sometimes it is impacting us without us being part of it. So how do we respond in those moments? Yeah, it helps with communicating, with leading others through change. So some other techniques that you can try. So we talked a little bit about self-awareness and self-management in the moment, especially as it relates to change. So here's a couple of strategies. When we think about self-awareness, thinking about, are you treating your emotions as either this really bad thing or this really good thing? And only good emotions are acceptable. Not necessarily, right? I just gave the example of, if change that even I've been feeling. Our company has gone through a tremendous amount of change. We had a significant merger back in 2020, and we've gone through multiple iterations of reorgs and restructures and everything in between. And I've shared a couple times, I'm kind of having a hard time with it too. But let's talk through it together, and let's figure out, how can we help as a team? What is our role in this change, and how can we help others through it? That may require you to lean into your discomfort, to recognize your strengths, to get to know yourself under stress. Yeah, so even with EQ awareness, the ability to have extra time to process, and that helps to bridge that gap between the self-awareness and self-management. Having the time to breathe, to practice, can go a long way, right? So breathing techniques we already talked about, counting to 10 in the moment, counting to 100, writing that email, and then walking away from it, sleeping on it perhaps, and then revisiting it with a fresh mind. Visualize yourself succeeding. Watch for your own discrepancies in terms of what your intent may be in the moment versus the impact that it may be having on others. And that'll start to bridge into social awareness that we'll talk about next. So yes, vulnerability and relating to who you are is key. Love thy neighbor. Yes, and treat thy neighbor how they want to be treated. That gets us into social awareness. So social awareness, I want to talk about what we readily see and what we don't readily see. And this is one of those elements that can make social intelligence or social awareness either really difficult, right? Because there's so much of who we are as individuals that's below the surface that we don't readily see. And it can make it tricky to understand what somebody might be experiencing or feeling in the moment. Or others might see it as an opportunity to ask questions, to learn more, to understand what others are feeling and experiencing. Social awareness can become even more tricky with people who are more dissimilar than us, right? So with individuals who are like us, who maybe grew up in the same town, went to the same school, have similar types of backgrounds, heritage, cultures, experiences, relating to them is often easier, right? We have those connection points. We can understand how their culture may be influencing their behaviors. But for others who are more different than ourselves, it can be trickier to understand how all those things that are below the surface are influencing and impacting the way that they show up, the way that they behave. And so we have to lean in with even more intentionality, lean in with even more courage and vulnerability to understand where they're coming from. Yeah, thank you. I know I love this image as well, and it just speaks to, the power of trying to understand what's below the surface, to elevate that in a beautiful, beautiful way, as much as individuals are willing to share, right? Again, we can't force anyone. We don't want to force anyone to share more than they're willing to, but can we ask questions with positive intentionality to have that greater impact? Yes, thank you, Crystal. I would also add below the surface neurodivergence. So neurodiversity, oftentimes we can't see that, right? And it's not above the surface, it'll be below the surface. And so how do we navigate those conversations? First, again, by leaning on our own self-awareness. What do we know about neurodiversity? What do we need to know about the way that they may be processing information, and how can we lean in and help? We're going to talk about that here in a minute as well. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I'd also put fear, right? Fear is oftentimes that thing that can get in our way. And again, it's not a negative emotion. It is an emotion that we need to recognize and acknowledge and consider how it could be impacting our behaviors. So thank you for your additional comments as we move along. So social awareness is really about being able to understand the emotions of others and to be able to then respond real time in a positive way. And the iceberg, again, is just demonstrating that a lot of what can be feeding into those emotions, even the emotions themselves, are likely below the surface. And so what are some techniques? We'll get into some strategies that you can use to help to understand that a little bit more. Yeah, Claire, appreciate your perspective. The immediate response required in today's environment also restricts people from changing their minds or allowing for the big picture thinking. What I would add to that, if I'm interpreting your comment correctly, is social awareness. There's this component of that intentionality and being able to lean in to understand, so that it might require us as individuals to unlearn something that has been below the surface for ourselves, right? To unlearn a belief that we've held on to for quite some time, a bias. We may have to unlearn so that we can relearn and learn it in a new way. And being able to engage in that conversation can be tricky, but leveraging emotional intelligence skill sets will help get you there. So let's talk about the last skill, relationship management. So far we've talked about self-awareness, being aware of your own emotions in the moment or even prior to an emotional reaction, so that if and when we get triggered, or even if it's a positive emotion, right? Again, kind of looking at the full range of different types of emotions, we can work towards self-management, taking that time, taking that practice in the moment to allow that emotion to travel to our rational part of the brain and manage it in a successful way. We also talked about social awareness, doing the same with others, understanding more about what's below the surface for people. And putting all those pieces together really speaks to relationship management. And when we practice relationship management, we can create inclusive and belonging workplaces. And I love this article. It really resonated with me, from HBR, Harvard Business Review, back in 2021, where it talked about just the value of connecting with people through empathy, which is such a key component of emotional intelligence, right? Being able to feel with someone. You got to lean in from an emotional intelligence standpoint to understand what others may be feeling and experiencing. And then leading with compassion, which takes it a step further in terms of willingness to take action. So, can we empathize with others, understand how their experiences may be different than ours, to the notion of being able to then act and help in the moment, and show that level of support, allyship, engagement? That's true inclusion. Oh, thank you for putting the link to the article in the chat. Appreciate that, Michelle. I don't know. Liz noted that her screen froze. Hopefully not for anyone else. I haven't seen any other comments come through regarding that. All right. So in terms of looking at relationship management and that connection to relation or to inclusion and belonging, right? It's about taking action. So understanding where you're coming from, what your needs are, those are all the self awareness, self-management, and then starting to learn about what the needs are of other individuals. Can we empathize with those needs so that then we can take action? Okay, phenomenal. So love to just wrap up here with some of these key strategies that really speak to more of the social awareness and relationship management component. So as we kind of think about putting all of this together, EQ really starts with ourselves, right? We have to put that mirror up to ourselves first before we can turn on and look towards others. So understanding your biases, leaning in with self-management types of techniques, so that then we can better understand others. And we already talked about this a little bit already, but my go-to strategy as it relates to both emotional intelligence to fostering workplaces of inclusion is about asking questions, leaning in with curiosity, courage, and vulnerability. I keep using that leaning in phrase because it's something that resonates with me. I visually think about leaning in to understand where somebody might be coming from, and so that I can listen to perhaps unlearn and then relearn. So asking questions, what might this look like? Right? So if you're trying to understand something perhaps that's below the surface, talking with an individual around, I'm really interested in learning more about your perspective on this topic. Would you be willing to share your experience with me? Right? Asking a question. Or if somebody says something in the moment and maybe you feel yourself start to have an emotional reaction, taking that moment to pause and ask a question such as, I think our perspectives differ. Would you mind sharing more about your perspective? What you're doing right there is a couple of things. You're giving yourself that pause that you may need to allow that emotional reaction to reach the rational part of your brain, right? To give yourself a little bit more time to pause, reflect, breathe, practice those techniques. And you're also leaning in to understand, right? So that means that you then have to be an active listener in terms of what the person is saying. Be that active listener. And you're also giving the other person an opportunity to share a little bit more about themselves. Perhaps bring some of those things that are below the surface up, and or practice rephrasing their perspective in a new way. It is a win-win situation more often than not. So a couple other strategies on here. Being able to watch your own body language, watch others' body language, understand what that may or may not look like. Practice repeating what you heard. Those back briefs can be really powerful to, again, pause and reflect. Here's what I heard. Did I capture that intent correctly? Paraphrasing can go a long way as well. Seek and provide real-time, meaningful feedback. to different types of individuals around you. Getting that feedback from others is going to help you understand what kind of impact you are having. Giving feedback is empowering others to grow and develop and belong. So those are a few more strategies that I've picked up on along the way. Just want to wrap up with and allow for a couple of minutes worth of questions. One of my favorite quotes in this space comes from Maya Angelou, who talks about people may forget what you said, what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel, right? And then just landing on a few more resources and different books, some different podcasts and resources that speak to emotional intelligence, leadership, vulnerability, and how to develop trust with others. So let me pause and see what other questions you have for me. Oh, good. Yeah, one of my favorites too. Yeah. And it just speaks to, that notion that we are emotional beings and how powerful a skill like emotional intelligence is. I know we're doing the recording. And so we mentioned at the start of this program that the recording will be accessible following this event. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that experience. On the job place, right? A lot of, even if you were thinking about your best and worst leaders and how they made you feel, right? It's kind of easy to remember that feeling that you had when you were around that best or worst leader, but you may not remember everything that person said or did, right? Oh, sure. I will go back one more slide. So I encourage you to think about that quote as well. And with just a few minutes left, feel free, if there are any questions, I'll keep an eye on the chat. I want to turn it back over to the Fairygodboss team and see if there's anything else you all would like to mention in order for us to close out today's session.
Thank you so much, Lexi. That was such a wonderful conversation. And kudos to all of the folks in attendance for participating and engaging in the conversation as well. It was such a wonderful discussion. And for those who had to step out a little early or may miss the conversation, as Lexi mentioned, this will be recorded. We will be sure to share this. Thank you all for your time. Lexi, thank you so much again as well.
Absolutely. And yes, thank you to all the participants. You all were incredible, made this fun and exciting for me as well. So I appreciate all the participation and the input and different perspectives and thoughts. So thank you for sharing. And I just appreciate Fairygodboss and your partnership. Thank you all.
Thank you.